Coming up.
This summer, how about a philosophical take on popular culture?
There are no good TV shows that are bad for you.
Sandra Laugier, author of TV Philosophy in Action, The Ethics and Politics of TV Series.
This whole rhetoric of ethics that is really about how you get better by meeting these flawed characters.
You can't do that in reality. You can really only do that in fiction.
Nathaniel Goldberg, co-author of Revising Reality, How Sequels, Remakes, Retcons, and Rejects Explain the World.
We could remake the story of Luke Skywalker where he is 97 feet tall, but that's going to be a different Luke Skywalker.
For any philosophy paper that I write, I could turn this into a short story and the other way around.
Sara Uckelman on philosophical science fiction.
Deep dives into pop culture for your summer reading list.
Coming up on Philosophy Talk. Can television be philosophical?
What do sequels and prequels tell us about history and science?
Is sci-fi just philosophy without the answers?
Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Josh Landy.
And I'm Ray Briggs. We're coming to you from the studios of KALW San Francisco Bay Area.
Continuing conversations that begin at Philosopher's Corner on the Stanford campus, where Ray teaches philosophy and I direct the Philosophy and Literature Initiative.
Today, it's our annual summer reading list. Thought-provoking books for thoughtful readers.
This year, we've got a couple of new books on our list that take deep dives into TV, film, and popular culture. In just a bit, we'll talk to Nathaniel Goldberg from Washington and Lee University, co-author of Revising Reality, How Sequels, Remakes, Retcons, and Rejects Explain the World.
We'll also ask Sandra Laugier from the University of Paris about her new book, TV Philosophy in Action, The Ethics and Politics of TV Series.
And we'll get recommendations for philosophical science fiction from Durham University philosopher and prolific author of her own speculative fiction, Sara Uckelman.
So let's start with those expanded fictional universes. Sequels, prequels, reboots, and retcons.
You know, sequels and prequels often get a bad rap, Ray, but every now and again, there's a real classic, like The Godfather 2.
I don't feel I have to wipe everybody out, Tom. Just my enemies, that's all.
Or Star Wars Rogue One.
They call it the Death Star. But they have no idea there's a way to defeat it.
Or one of my favorites, Mad Max Fury Road.
We go back?
Back?
Yeah.
I thought you weren't insane anymore.
And isn't The Odyssey kind of a sequel to the Iliad?
Oh, that's a great one, Ray.
Okay, but what about reboots and retcons? What exactly is the difference between those?
Well, both of them change something important in the fictional world. It's just that the retcon, that is a case of retroactive continuity, that pretends, things were always this way from the beginning.
So like when Arthur Conan Doyle kills off Sherlock Holmes at Reichenbach Falls and then 10 years later decides that actually he made a miraculous escape.
Exactly. That's a classic case of a retcon. But a reboot is different. A reboot says, hey, we're just starting over. We're not even going to pretend that these two fictional worlds totally hang together.
Oh, so that would be like Batman Begins, where Christopher Nolan created a totally different version of that character from the one in the other movies, and he's brooding and grimdark and traumatized and very fallible.
My bets lost away.
That's frightened me. This time my enemies shared my dread.
So that's a reboot.
Absolutely. That's a great example. And that means we now have on the table 4 different ways of expanding fictional universes: sequels, prequels, reboots, and retcons. And our guest, Nathaniel Goldberg, thinks they explain the world.
In fact, that's the title of his book, co-authored with Chris Gavaler, Revising Reality, How Sequels, Remakes, Retcons, and Rejects Explain the World. We asked Nat how these concepts from fiction and literature apply to reality.
So sequels occur whenever something new is added, like think every time Congress passes a law, it's one after the other. Think of the 18th Amendment says prohibition, can't have alcohol in the U.S., can't be sold. 21st says, nope, let's sequel that decision and say that you can. It went from being illegal to being legal. So that's sequel in the case of law.
I want to ask about retcons in the case of law. So you find some places in the legal canon where people are using the word retcon to talk about law. and they kind of disagree about whether this is a good or a bad thing. Like, why might I be okay with law being retconned?
Sure. So legislatures don't themselves retcon. It's not like alcohol was always allowed in the U.S. and we just mistakenly thought that the amendment said it wasn't. But judicial decisions, acts of law courts, especially the Supreme Court, that's where retconning happens. So a very recent case, the recent Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, doesn't say that abortion was protected in the past and now it's not. The actual wording of the Dobbs decision says that abortion was never a protected right. It is making retroactively clear that Roe v. Wade was decided incorrectly.
This was the one that really leapt out at me and screamed, yeah, these categories really do apply. That is to say, these categories from the world of fiction, thinking about successive works of fiction as sequels, prequels, reboots, retcons, really does seem to apply to the world of law. I was thinking, look, you've got these originalists in the United States who are basically retconners, right? They're saying, we're not changing the law. We're just showing you what was there all along, even if in some cases maybe it's not entirely true. You've got some progressives presumably calling for a reboot. Maybe we should ditch this particular constitution or some parts of it at least and start again. I'm not saying all progressives. And then presumably you've got some incrementalists who like sequels. It's, well, the laws, the Constitution's pretty good, but maybe we need an amendment or two just to kind of update things for the present day. Does that sort of landscape seem about right to you?
It does, with the exception of the reboot or remake point, because for that kind of revision, you really are starting over and projecting a different kind of story to begin with. Like we'd have a whole new country or a whole new constitution. And even in that case, that may not actually be a reboot, because reboots are like starting a new Batman series. And you can't do that in reality. You can really only do that in fiction.
So I want to move now to history, because that's a place where somebody might be more worried, particularly about retcons. So sure, law is human-made and we can reinterpret it. But history, like that just stuff happened or it didn't. Does it make sense to retcon history?
Right, that's a great question. So the word history is actually ambiguous. It can mean either past events, which we can't change because we can't change the past, or it could mean what we have to say about those past events. Like a history book isn't past events, it's a story of past events. So nobody's, at least I'm not saying that we're ever going to change past events, but we can reinterpret our understanding of them. So I can give a quick example that made some news in higher ed a bunch of years ago. The New York Times published something called the 1619 Project that reinterpreted, and I want to say retconned, U.S. history by saying that the pivotal moment was the introduction of Africans as slaves in Virginia in 1619. And that reinterpretation got a lot of people upset and a lot of other people really interested. So that's a kind of retconning of history, not the events, but our understanding of the events.
So in both the fiction case and the history case, I'm kind of curious about whether there's a right answer. With history, I'm more tempted to think, look, there's one thing that's, if I can borrow a term from literature, canon. And for like actual Star Wars universe, I don't know, there's a lot of canons. Would you agree with that distinction, or do you think it's more complicated than that?
Oh, that's easy. I think whenever you ask a philosopher a question, do you agree or think it's more complicated? Obviously, I think it's more complicated. But I hear you. There's something to what you're saying. But I do, in all seriousness, think that it is a little bit more complicated. Because the way that we write stories, at least, there's a conceit to fiction that authors themselves may not fully know the implications of their stories. And that suggests that even if it is ultimately fiction that is something created, there still might be facts about it that are not known by the particular reader, even the writer. So in that thin sort of sense, we can still discover things about stories that are fictional. But I hear you, not in the robust kind of way that we can about history or science. So lots of the examples in the book draw from science as well. And when we discover a new planet, say, that's usually a sequel discovery, because we're just adding to what we discovered before. But if we decide that, this whole time we thought planets circled the Earth, but they actually circle the sun, that's a reinterpretation. That is a retcon of our understanding. planets always circle the sun. We just didn't realize it.
Nat, I have a question about canon versus fan fiction. And this is a question a little bit about fiction, but a little bit about history, just in the spirit of your book, Revising Reality. So what I think I've noticed is there are two kinds of people in the world. There's the kind that really wants there to be canon. So, they really care whether such and such a detail in Star Wars is sort of legitimated by the authors or something like that. And then there's the kind that doesn't really care and, in fact, might very well prefer a work of fan fiction that isn't quote-unquote canon. On the side of history, you've got people who really like the idea that, there's a set of facts and we can get to those facts. Maybe there's even ultimately one best explanation, one best interpretation, one best answer to the question of how did the Civil War start, or when was America really begun, and things like that. And on the other side, you've got they've got the postmodernists who love the idea that we will never have such a thing, and we can revel in all these different stories. I wonder how we can somehow adjudicate. Well, first of all, are those two things aligned according to you? Do you think it's the same kind of person who loves reveling in many different versions of history and who loves reveling in many different fan fictions? Is there a kind of psychological similarity between the kind of person who gravitates to a certain kind of history and the kind of person who gravitates to a certain kind of picture of canon versus fan fiction?
I mean, there might be if history is meant in the sense of understanding or interpretation. So I recently taught a course on philosophy of history, and there are those who think that history is basically like novel writing, just a bunch of stories that somehow triangulate the facts, whatever that is. But then history in the sense of the facts, whatever they are, that's going to be fixed. So, Josh, if you're asking people who like fan fiction versus people who like alternative histories, if you mean alternative or different histories in the sense of different facts, then no, those are different because the facts are the facts. But if you mean people who like reading different history books about the same event, then maybe that is a kind of loosening of the canon because they're trying to get different perspectives on the same thing. But in the reality case, the history case, the same thing are going to be the fixed facts.
Yeah,
the Magna Carta really was signed in 1215, whether or not we interpret it as a good thing or a bad thing for democracy.
Yes. Okay, but I have to confess I'm on the canon side. And I'm not quite sure why in the case of fiction. But I feel like I want even the world of fiction to push back against me, to resist me, right? So I can't just make Star Wars be whatever it is. I can't make Luke Skywalker be 97 feet tall because even the fictional world pushes back against me. And there's something salutary about the resistance in the same way as the real world pushes back upon me. I can't make the Magna Carta have been signed in 2024. So what's going on inside my brain? Psychoanalyze me.
Sure. So maybe this is a place where the distinction between remakes and the other kinds of revisions come in. So we can say, depending upon our theory of literature, which I don't have a fictional or factual dog in that race, but some people think that the meaning of literature is based on the author's intent, and other people think it's based on reader response. However we think it's fixed, maybe some people think it's not really fixed. Let's suppose it is. If it is fixed in some way, then sure, we could have a different story. We could remake the story of Luke Skywalker where he is 97 feet tall, but that's going to be a different Luke Skywalker, just like every time there's a new Batman installment, sometimes Robin's with him, sometimes his parents are killed in the cave or he's in the cave with it, but whatever the story is, they're minor variations, but we understand them that it's not actually the same Batman because, one Batman had some events happen to him and another Batman another. So we can, if I'm being, psychoanalytic, maybe say, Josh, that maybe you do like the idea of remakes, just starting over and giving different versions. Whereas if you think that there is something fixed in fiction, and I guess like you, I'm on the canon side as well, then we're just going to say every time there's a remake, you're no longer in the canon.
So I want to push back a little bit from the side of people who love fan fiction. both because I think like there's better and worse fan fiction, right? Like it's not all on a par. And I think like, okay, there are some things that your history has to respect, like the facts. And there are some things that your science has to respect, like the empirical observations. But there are a lot of different interpretations that are good, that are compatible with those facts. Like which ones are relevant? You just can't pick out a large enough set to pick out everything relevant. So which ones are you going to focus on? And then for scientific theories, we can have lots of empirically adequate scientific theories, and maybe one is good for one purpose and maybe one is good for another purpose. It doesn't mean everything is on a par. So I just wanted to defend the fanfic against the insistence on a single canon.
Yeah, and some fanfic becomes canon, right? That's how good it is.
I'm just thinking about 50 Shades of Grey. And I'm not sure
that wasn't
because
what I had
it
in
was good. Nat, it's our summer reading show, and for our last question, we'd like you to share with us a favorite work of fiction that reimagines something prior, either as a sequel or a reboot or a retcon. What's your favorite work of fiction in that category?
Sure. So maybe my favorite retcon is in the original version of The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Gollum is described as a happy-go-lucky, slimy sort of creature, but an all-around good guy who gives Bilbo this magic ring. And then I think those of us who've read the books and seen the movies know that in Lord of the Rings and then a later version of The Hobbit, Gollum is described as an evil kind of creature, and it turns out Bilbo lied about how he got the ring. On the lying version, that's a retcon. Tolkien is basically saying that we thought that Bilbo told the truth, that he got the ring from this happy-go-lucky creature, but really, he took it and in a way stole it. So that's my favorite retcon. And in the world of film, we learn in the Star Wars sequel trilogy that this character named Rey is a nobody. She's just abandoned on some planet. But then we learn in a later movie that actually, all along, this gets retconned, she was a Palpatine, descended from like the granddaughter of the Emperor.
I'm one of the people who was a little irked by what J.J. Abrams did.
Oh, I couldn't.
Rian Johnson's using
So there's a case where I think we're more than justified in rejecting the sequel.
Nat, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, both of you, for your time. This has been loads of fun.
Nathaniel Goldberg from Washington and Lee University, co-author of Revising Reality: How Sequels, Remakes, Retcons, and Rejects Explain the World.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk, and today we're putting together our annual summer reading list.
Coming up, philosophical questions raised by your favorite TV shows, plus suggestions for summer sci-fi, when Philosophy Talk continues.
This is Philosophy Talk, and it's our annual summer reading list. I'm Josh Landy, here with my Stanford colleague Ray Briggs.
All that talk about prequels, sequels, and reboots makes me want to watch some smart philosophical television.
Okay, but what does it mean for television to be philosophical?
Let's ask Sandra Laugier. She's professor of philosophy at the Sorbonne in Paris and author of the recent book, TV Philosophy in Action: The Ethics and Politics of TV Series.
We asked her what kinds of insight you can get by turning your philosophical attention to television.
Television, it's a very interesting phenomenon because when you watch a TV show for like maybe 15 years, like ER, for example, or even 5 years, like 6 Feet Under, to give two examples, actually it becomes really part of the main events, some of the main events of your life, like memories of your own life, and you get attached to characters. And you kind of know them as if they are real. So it's something that what we would call an ontological question about the reality of these characters, because they are fictional, but they are really there. So I'm very interested in that. And also, and this is why the title is The Ethics and Politics of TV Shows, the fact that they have such an ethical importance. And these shows are really providing a moral education to their viewers, just as Hollywood movies in the last century now, political and moral education comes from these shows.
So one example you've talked about is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And you connect that to care ethics, which is something you've written about separately. Can you tell us a little bit about care ethics and how it shows up in Buffy the Vampire Slayer?
Actually, Buffy is really one of my favorite shows. It's so powerful because you have this character, which is this kind of, supernatural, very strong young woman. And so I was interested, of course, in the fact that the show was educating its audience about women and feminism. But also, Buffy is not only a superhero, but she's also very caring. She's not isolated like other, killers, the slayers, but she has this family she cares about, and also her friends. And so the group is very important here. And this is true for so many shows. The fact that it's not only about one individual, usually male and so on, but it's really about groups and families very often. So this topic of care is central to many TV shows, like, for example, ER that I mentioned. It's really also about care, and many recent good shows like This Is Us, they are really representing care. And I found it very interesting also that, during the pandemic, you had so many series that people went back to this series because it was representing care, but also because, it was taking care. The series shows were taking care of their audience.
So this is a way in which, TV can be good for us. It can give us a good moral education. Is there also a risk that TV might give people a bad moral education if you put the wrong things on it?
This is a very important question, and I hear it a lot. Of course, you can be reluctant, and you can also dismiss TV shows. But for me, there are no good TV shows that are bad for you. There are bad TV shows, and I don't want to talk about that. But, even if you have a very mean character, like, Tony Soprano, or even, characters in Mad Men, it's, of course, you have some very, morally contemptible characters, but they are still very interesting for you to watch, and they can be a source of moral education for you. Like, the best TV show maybe is Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, and it's all about ethics. Of course, it's really about the ethics you can get from these flawed characters. And this ethical ambition is really there because so many titles of TV shows have good and bad in it, like The Good Wife, The Good Place, Better Call Saul, Saul Goodman. This is really this whole rhetoric of ethics that actually is really about how you get better by meeting these bad or flawed people.
That's cheerful, but we know of some cases where it didn't go that way. So Fight Club, which is one of my favorite films, which I do not think is an immoral film. A lot of people watch that film and think, yeah, that's what I want to be like that. There was an individual who actually blew up a Starbucks after watching Fight Club. 24, which I know is one of your favorites, that show was criticized, I think, reasonably for presenting torture as a reasonable strategy in situations where there's time pressure, the so-called ticking time bomb scenario. And that, of course, was at the height of the post-9/11 Patriot Act sort of moment in the United States. It seems like, shouldn't we be worried, as Ray's saying, that in some cases, these even good shows, because they're morally complicated, the best shows are not simple morality tales, I hope. And so if they're going to be complicated, isn't there a risk that, we could say there's a risk things go awry. We could also say correspondingly there's an opportunity for other things to happen than just moral education.
I agree that there's a risk, but as you say, these good shows, they're complex, and it's the complexity itself. The fact that they can be, of course, used in a bad way that, make the quality too. And the fact that you yourself, you both, can see the risk in that and see the complexity, it means that actually someone who is watching 24, and this is my hope, this is why I'm always too cheerful, my hope is that the show educates you to understand that there's something maybe wrong, not in it also, and in its ambivalence toward this. And I think this is what is interesting, is that this education makes the viewer able to decide, because there is this kind of experience and this empowerment of her own experience by seeing a show. And I think it's really also about exploring a specific genre. If you see only 24, then probably you will end up having stupid ideas. Although, in 24, you have some very nice Muslim characters. You have a black president. I mean, you have many nice things too. But anyway, when you see only 24, but you might have the wrong idea. But if you see 24, but also Homeland, but also Tehran, but also The Bureau, this French show, which is great, then you have a whole picture of what can be done as in a show about security and terrorism.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. Today it's our annual summer reading special, and we're talking to Sandra Laugier from the Sorbonne in Paris, author of TV Philosophy in Action, The Ethics and Politics of TV Series.
I think I'm still a little worried. I kind of have similar worries actually about Mad Men. I didn't like 24. But I really did like Mad Men, and I thought this is kind of glamorizing this 1950s culture of like men getting day drunk in their offices and hitting on their secretaries, and like, gosh, John Hamm looks great doing it. But I both am enjoying this and am not sure about the moral education. So this is a case where like I think it is an aesthetically good show, but like, I'm not even sure about the moral education I'm getting. That's not really why I'm there. So you think my qualms are misplaced?
No, not at all, actually. But John Hamm is great. That's true. And he's still great. I mean, you've seen him in Fargo, and he still has this same persona. But Mad Men was aesthetically really, kind of ideal. And I agree that it presents a reality, but, it's really about... It's a more general question about how can we deal with representations of a past reality that we don't like anymore. But I think for me, but maybe it's very French to say so, for me it's very educational to see works of art that represent something we disagree on. And this is what actually they are here also for. So it's good that someone sees these shows, but as you say, of course, not as a reality we have to aspire to, but something we are now able to criticize and distance us from, but also to understand what was attractive about this way of life, aesthetically, but even morally.
So it seems like there are two possibilities in play here, right? So one possibility, and I have to confess it's the one I like better, is the one in your book you call democratic. So that's the possibility we've just been talking about, which is that really great shows are morally complicated, and our task is to sort of figure out what we think. And that itself is beneficial for us in terms of, sharpening our moral tools and expanding moral imagination. The other possibility is that it was the one we were talking about earlier, where a TV show teaches us, educates us. And you talk about shows having lessons and shows educating and learning value and so on. And so Buffy is supposed to teach us to be better people. Which one do you like better?
Actually, I think both are really in the same task. When I talk about education, it's not only about, teaching and feeding you with some lessons and things you should do, because actually even Buffy doesn't tell you what to
It tells you how to fight vampires.
Yeah, but how to live and so on. So it's when I talk about education, and here again I'm really influenced by Stanley Cavell, who was himself influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is your great American thinker, who really thinks that education is really just about giving you the strength and the autonomy and the self-reliance, independence to make your own judgment. And for me, this is what watching lots of TV, not only one show, offers you. The fact that you get used enough to a genre, then you are able to really have your own judgment too. So you have somehow to educate yourself. And so this is a very important part of philosophy and of moral perfectionism, as Emerson would say.
So I have what might be like a peculiarly American question, which is about representation and about representation of like different kinds and identities of people. And I think this is something that Americans are super focused on. Do you think that the makers of television shows have a responsibility to achieve any kind of demographic representation, and that they can sort of do well or badly at it? Or do you think that that's not a going concern?
Actually, it has always been the main concern of TV. This is why also many people dismiss TV or underestimate it, because TV shows and really needed to have a wide audience and have everyone represented. If you are a black person, you can see a white person representing you maybe for 1 hour, but for 8 seasons, maybe you don't like that. So it has been very important for TV to have minorities, to have a woman. So I think the fact that, you need to have a wide audience for a TV show has been a strength for me compared to what I see, this time maybe in a French way, as a very male-dominated white, film industry. And TV, of course, is not perfect, and minorities have not been represented enough, but you have always seen much more women, much more non-white people. Old women, for example, you see them only on TV shows. I mean, so...
the Golden Girls, all about friendships between old women.
And of course, we think of Buffy, who's maybe the Ura protagonist here, at least in your book. And what you say about vampire fiction is so beautiful, that vampire fiction is about a lot of different things, but one of the things it's about is mutability. Can you say a little bit about that? Like, how does vampire fiction capture the mutability of human life?
Yeah, it's so strange, actually, that this vampire fiction has been so huge. So I had to, not only Buffy, but this whole, Twilight. And
True Blood.
It's so important and has really given some very creative fiction on TV. So it's a real question. But for me, it really takes us back to the basic philosophical question of what these shows are about. And this vampire fiction, they really show what it is to change, because you see the characters changing, and you see this kind of metaphorical representation of sexuality by this physical change that are not the change, you can some changes you couldn't really see on screen, but you have changes like this kind of physical transformation. But also it's really about what is it to change when you are growing up, when you're a teenager, and when you have this kind of body that somehow is mysterious. And also it's really also about what it is to be the difference between dead or alive, and what it is to feel alive, because all these vampires, of course, they are dead, but what these shows are presenting us is, the desire and the fact to be alive, to have a life even when you are dead. And I think it's something that is not easy to represent.
So I have to ask, do you have a favorite TV show, maybe other than Buffy, because we've already covered Buffy, that you'd like to recommend to our listeners, and a reason why?
Yeah, I like Buffy, that's for sure, but it's not the only show I like. I always promote it because many people don't take it seriously, but I'm also a very conventional person, and I like TV shows that everyone likes. So I like The Wire, for me, David Simon. It's really a show for me that is very powerful because it has this, descriptive sociological ambition, but also that has all these minorities that are present, and I also think it's important, and also these moral issues that are so powerful. So of course I love The Wire, and if I am allowed to
let's hear another one,
too, of course I also love, as I said, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, because they are very powerful shows, and also because they really kind of represent what this medium can do at best. Because, sometimes you have very good TV show, but it's peculiar, like Buffy, it's specific. And I go back to Caver and about film studies and TV studies, a work of art has to somehow represent what you expect from the genre and the art. And for me, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul are really some kind of idea of what you can do with a TV show.
Sandra, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much, and pardon my English.
Sandra Laugier from the University of Paris, author of TV Philosophy in Action, The Ethics and Politics of TV Series.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk, and today we're compiling our annual summer reading list.
Coming up, science fiction suggestions from Sara Uckelman, philosopher of language by day, writer of speculative fiction by night, when Philosophy Talk continues.
It's our annual summer reading list. I'm Josh Landy, and this is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Ray Briggs. We're talking about thought-provoking books for thoughtful summer reading.
Something I love reading in the summer is science fiction. It's full of philosophical thought experiments.
Yeah, but don't you get frustrated that it has more questions in it than answers?
Au contraire, that's what I love about it. I think the writers design their stories that way on purpose.
Let's ask one of them. Sara Uckelman is professor of philosophy at Durham University in the UK, but she is also a prolific writer of speculative fiction. She told us how her philosophical work and her creative work fit together.
What I have discovered in the last decade or so of writing lots of logic, writing lots of fiction, is that it really is just two sides of the same coin. All of the things that I need to engage with logical structures, to write a good logical paper, to get the reader invested in whatever niche problem I'm interested in, these are exactly the same skills that I need to tell an engaging story, to get characters that a reader is involved in, to put them into problems and difficulties that the reader wants to see them get out of.
So, Sara, could you give us an example of a story that you've written that you think is interestingly philosophical, and say just a little bit about the philosophical questions that story raises?
Sure. It's something I wrote a while ago now, but it's still one of my favorites. It's called The Platform Between Heaven and Earth. And a lot of my stories start from what-if questions, and the what-if question in this case stemmed from a comment that a friend made. He misspoke, and he said, language was made for us to miscommunicate with each other.
Is that possible?
Well, as soon as you hear something like this, what does it make you think of?
The Tower of Babel.
Bingo! I wanted to write a Tower of Babel story. And that's actually where the title comes from. The one of the historical ziggurats that is sometimes kind of pointed to as being the historical Tower of Babel, its name translates as the platform between heaven and earth.
So what happens with the Tower of Babel in your story?
I started doing a bunch of research into kind of the traditional Tower of Babel stories because I wanted to tell one of them, but not the one that everybody knows. What's the Tower of Babel story that you know?
The one that I've heard is that human beings wanted to rival God, and so they built a tower that was so tall it reached into the heavens, and God got mad at them and made them speak a bunch of different languages so they could not communicate as well, so they couldn't engineer such awesome towers in the future.
Right. You heard the punishment story.
Mm-hmm.
This is the Christian version. Unsurprising. They took a story that had already been in kind of ancient circulation and added on vengeance and punishment and hubris and pride. And these are not actually aspects of the original versions of the story. So this led me to a particular question, which I wanted to explore, which was, how could you tell a Tower of Babel story where the gods confusing everybody's language was not as a punishment, but as sort of a transformative step to allow them a greater level of communication or understanding that they didn't have before?
Okay, that sounds paradoxical. So how is it to our benefit communicationally that languages don't communicate, or that there's something flawed with languages?
The idea was, if humans can all talk with each other, it doesn't mean that we can still talk to the divine in the same sort of way. And sort of the premise of the story is that everybody has been praying to the gods, but the gods have never responded. But from the gods' point of view, it's like they've been trying to talk to these people, but nobody has been listening because nobody has been taught to listen to a language or a form of communication that they don't already understand.
This is a kind of really neat, take on noisy communication and maybe difficult communication. I love it. I want to ask about other stories you've written. So do you have another favorite to tell us about?
I've got one which is kind of straight out of the philosophical thought experiment literature. Are you familiar with the grandfather paradox?
Okay, so is this the whole Back to the Future thing? If you were able to travel back in time, you might inadvertently end the life of your grandfather and thus eliminate your own self in the future. And some people take that to be a proof that time travel isn't possible. Is that the kind of space that we're talking about here?
Yeah, just the idea that someone goes back in time, messes something up, everything gets problematic, ergo time travel can't happen. And it struck me after I had worked through with some of my philosophy students about this paradox and related ones, that it's always the men going back in time and screwing everything up. Surely if the women were the ones who were in charge, this wouldn't happen. And so I wrote the grandmother paradox, which is just a simple time travel story where it's a woman, she goes back in time, visits her younger self, and they fix something rather than destroying it.
That's beautiful. I mean, isn't it just as paradoxical for the time travel, though?
Sure.
If I notice something is bad now and I go back in the past to make it never have happened, and it was my motivation for going back in the past, what explains why I left in the time machine in the first place?
You still get the paradox, but the brilliant thing about stories, as opposed to like philosophy argument papers, is I don't have to solve it. I just have to tell you a good story about it.
That is very well said. That is one of the great beauties of literature. Not only do you not have to answer the questions, but it can be a great boon, to the story, for the reading experience. Is that something that you've discovered in your interactions with readers, that it sort of adds something to the success and the effect and the impact of a story, that you leave things a little bit open, a little bit so they sort of gnaw away at readers? Is that a kind of interaction you've had, a kind of feedback you've had about your stories?
I'm not sure specifically about my own stories, but certainly kind of about good stories in general. The ones that are satisfying are the ones that require reader input. And this might be in the form of grappling with these unresolved questions, trying to figure out, do I find this a problem? Do I think this is a paradox? Does it all make sense to me? But also even at the level of just a good story is one where the reader has to make a bunch of inference. So you don't say everything, you let the reader fill in all of the gaps, because then everybody's going to fill them in a slightly different way. And so you get a very rich sort of story experience that way.
So this kind of moves us nicely from thinking about you as a writer of stories to thinking of you as a reader of stories. Do you have any stories or books to recommend for our listeners for their summer reading?
Absolutely. So if you like time travel stories that kind of flirt with the paradox but don't necessarily try to resolve it, Natasha Pulley's novel The Kingdoms was one of the best things that I have read in recent years. I inhaled it in about 2 or 3 days. I waited a day, and then I read it again. Highly recommended.
Okay, could you tell us in a nutshell what's going on in there?
There's time travel, and no, I can't say much more than that without ruining
the
great. Brilliance of
no
it.
spoilers. But okay, so maybe I'll ask you a different question. What philosophical issues are raised by this novel?
It's got some really interesting kind of oblique considerations of personal identity. And when one person is the same, either because they've gone back in time or even because of more simple questions such as memory. When you lose a certain portion of your memory, how does this affect who you are as a person? Are you still the same person as this essentially other person who has all of these experiences and all of these memories and all of these friends and relationships that you don't have access to anymore?
That's a great question, both for time travel stories and in general. I think one of my favorite things about speculative fiction is the way that it gives you sort of more dramatic versions of puzzles that we all face in everyday life. Like, I think anybody who's had an older relative with dementia probably has had to worry about this.
The other one that I have to give a shout out to, because it was one that I went back to my logic students and said, if you need summer reading, read this book.
Oh boy.
It's R.F. Kuang's Babel.
Another Babel story.
Yes. It is about language. It is about translation. It is about questions of access and exclusion, about colonization and colonialism. It's set in like 1830s Oxford, and yet the periods of strike action were mirroring the strike action at universities that I was involved in at the time I was reading the book. So it was just this kind of, all of these little threads came together to create this wonderful, wonderful experience.
So it sounds like it's raising certain historical and political questions, but also, by the sound of it, a set of philosophical questions about language, I take it. I mean, does it hook up to what we were saying before? Does it hook up to questions of, for example, the relationship between language and thought? How much the language that somebody is brought up to speak affects the way that they think?
Yes, in quite a literal sort of way. So the premise of the magical system in Kuang's book is that there is no direct translation of words from one language to another. There's always going to be kind of bits on the edges that aren't captured. And you can then use translation as a means of essentially those bits that are left over. That's where you get your magical power. And so you want to find as close a translation match as you can to get kind of the strongest match. But sometimes you might have a concept in one language that is just untranslatable, or you can say lots of things around it, but it never quite grasps it. And so it really forces you as a reader to kind of face, well, what are the parts of my own language that I can't translate into someone else's language, or that can't be translated into my language? And what do we lose, or what do we gain when we can't say these things? Yeah, I like language and questions about what we can and cannot say.
So, Sarah, I've really enjoyed this conversation today. Some of my favorite works of fiction fall into this category of philosophical sci-fi. Ursula Le Guin, Liu Cixin, Kurt Vonnegut, Ted Chiang. So much wonderful stuff out there. And, of course, your own fantastic stories. Do you have any advice for people who want to get started writing stories like this, or writing novels or screenplays in this domain of philosophical speculative fiction?
Oh, do I have advice? The first thing is, if you've never done anything like this before, don't start with the novel. Novels are big, complex structures, and just as you wouldn't sit down and start by writing a philosophy book, don't aim to write a philosophy novel. Go for the short things, the short story, the journal paper, or the flash fiction, or the analysis article.
Or the drabble.
Yes, or the drabble. It's exactly 100 words. So it requires the ability to kind of get a single idea into a very small space. And that is actually the advice that I give when I am trying to convince philosophers that they should think about writing fiction as a philosophical methodology. I always end with a challenge to take a philosophical prompt and write a 100-word story on it. They're great because they don't take very much time. You can do 5 or 6 of them, and if none of them are any good, you've only spent half an hour.
That's really good advice. And I also like your advice from earlier to keep things a little bit open, invite reader input. That all sounds like a great recipe for some really cool fiction. Thank you so much for joining us today, for all your great suggestions.
Thank you again for having me. It's always fun to talk about things that I'm writing, things that I'm reading, and hopefully share the excitement with other people.
Sara Uckelman from Durham University, with her suggestions for philosophical science fiction reading this summer.
You can find all the books we've talked about on today's show, along with other recommendations from listeners, over at our website, philosophytalk.org.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of KALW Local Public Radio San Francisco Bay Area and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University. Copyright 2024.
Our executive producer is Ben Trefny.
The senior producer is Devin Strolovich. Laura McGuire is our director of research.
Thanks also to Pedro Jimenez, Merle Kessler, and Angela Johnston.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from various groups at Stanford University and from subscribers to our online community of thinkers.
And from the members of KLW Local Public Radio San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed
or misexpressed
on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Not even when they're true and reasonable. The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org, where you can become a subscriber and explore our library of nearly 600 episodes. I'm Josh Lamb.
And I'm Ray Briggs. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.
Yeah.